Welcome back to Sleepy Science History. I wonder, have you ever floated in the water and thought, what if I never had to come back up? What if you could take in the ocean with the same ease that you draw a breath of air right now? It's such a strange question, and yet it feels so natural. Humans have always been pulled toward water. Swimming, sailing, diving, staring into its depths as though it were another world. But what if it weren't another world at all? What if it were home? Imagine lying back in a calm lagoon. Instead of holding your breath, instead of the rising pressure in your chest, you simply inhale. Cool water fills your lungs, but it doesn't harm you. Instead, your body has found a way to take oxygen from the liquid itself, just like a fish sliding through reeds or a shark gliding silently under waves. Can you picture that moment? The silence, the stillness, the absence of any need to rush? But could it really be possible? Let's ask slowly, carefully, like one might ask a riddle whispered by the sea. What does breathing even mean? You and I both take it for granted, air in, air out, chest rising and falling like a tide. But breathing isn't simply pulling air into lungs. It's about exchange. Oxygen enters, carbon dioxide leaves. A trade, a rhythm, a deal struck between body and atmosphere every few seconds. Now ask yourself, could that trade still happen if the lungs weren't filled with air, but with water? Fish do it, after all. Their gills act like filters, separating the precious oxygen molecules from the water around them. The question then lingers, why don't humans already have such a trick? Did evolution skip us, or did it push us in a different direction? And more curiously, what if, under another history, it hadn't? Think of our ancestors, long before they walked upright on savannas. Once upon a time, the story of life was a story written entirely in the water. For millions of years, no creature set foot on land. We are, in a way, latecomers to the dry world. Doesn't that make you wonder? Could evolution have turned the story differently? Could we have stayed in the sea? I like to imagine two paths. In one, you and I are land dwellers as we are today, lungs thirsty for open air. In the other, perhaps we never lost a watery gift. We grow up swimming before we walk. Our homes are not houses but coral caverns or carved shells. And our songs echo not through air but through rippling currents. Which version feels more natural to you? Now let's slow down and think about the mechanics. Your lungs are spongy, delicate, made to expand and contract in rhythm. They aren't designed for water. Fill them with liquid and they struggle. Drowning is simply this mismatch made fatal. But could we imagine an alternative? What if lungs were not bags of air, but something more like a net, thin, intricate, drawing oxygen out of each passing drop? A set of internal gills. Would that change the way our bodies looked? Would our chests be wider? Would our skin carry slits along the neck like fish do? And how would that feel to never breathe air again? Would the surface of the world seem hostile, dry, almost painful? Would standing on a beach be as dangerous as sinking for us is now? It's easy to forget how strange our own biology already is. Whales, for example, are mammals who return to the sea, yet they still need air. They carry oxygen in their blood like a portable supply, diving deep, resurfacing like swimmers desperate for a gulp. But in another branch of possibility, maybe whales too could have developed true underwater breathing. Maybe evolution doesn't give gifts unless it needs to. And perhaps for humans, the story of survival was written above the waves, not below. But still, the question persists. What if? Think of the possibilities. Cities built in lagoons. Streets that are currents, not pavements. Lamps glowing with bioluminescent algae instead of fire. Travel by drift, by tide, by following the slow songs of whales across an endless blue expanse. Could human voices even exist underwater? Perhaps not in the way we speak now, but maybe we'd whistle, hum, or pulse vibrations through water like dolphins do. And what of food? Would we farm seaweed, or cultivate vast coral gardens like orchards? Would fishing even exist if we ourselves were the fish-like people of the sea? Would dolphins and humans share a language, allies in the great choir of waves? Every question opens another, doesn't it? That's the fun of wondering at night, when the world is quiet and possibilities unfold like ripples spreading outward. There's also something deeply poetic about water itself. After all, our bodies are already made mostly of it. Our blood carries salt just like the ocean. When you think about it, don't you feel a kind of kinship with the sea already? Maybe breathing underwater isn't so alien. Maybe it's a forgotten memory, tucked inside the cells that once swam free billions of years ago. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine sinking slowly into a clear bay. Instead of panic, there's calm. Instead of fear, curiosity. You open your mouth and instead of choking, you live. The water becomes part of you. Every tide is a breath, every wave a sigh. And yet, I wonder, would we miss the sky? Would clouds and birds feel like myths? Would stars be distant dreams glimpsed only from shallow waters at night? Perhaps underwater humans would tell stories of a dry world above, a place too bright, too thin, where creatures move awkwardly with lungs that dry out. A fantasy reversed. But maybe, just maybe, we'd find a balance. Some of us rising to breathe the air, others remaining beneath. A dual species caught between two worlds. Would that make us more connected or more divided? You see, the beauty of a question like this isn't the answer. It's the slow unfurling of images, like watching a jellyfish pulse through clear waters. Gentle, deliberate, mysterious. The science of it grounds us, oxygen, lungs, evolution. But the imagination of it frees us. Worlds beneath the surface, songs sung in bubbles, homes that sway with the tides. And perhaps the most comforting thought is this. Even though we cannot breathe underwater, we still seek it out. We snorkel, dive, hold our breath, and slip into that other realm, even for a moment. Maybe part of us longs to return. So let's sit with that longing, not rushing to fix it, but letting it rest like sand settling on the ocean floor. Ask yourself, if you could breathe underwater tonight, where would you go? Would you explore coral cathedrals? Or follow glowing plankton through the dark? Would you drift quietly, letting the sea carry you where it wished? The ocean keeps its secrets well. And maybe one of those secrets is a reminder that we were once more at home there than we are now. So what if humans could breathe underwater? Perhaps we'd be different creatures entirely. Or perhaps we'd simply be more ourselves, closer to the water we've always carried within. For now, we're left with the mystery and the soft sound of our own breath. Air, not water, but still the same rhythm of life, in and out, like the tides. Have you ever wondered how different our bodies might feel if they were shaped not for the air but for the sea? When you take a deep breath now, your ribs rise, your chest swells, and you feel the familiar lift of air filling soft lungs. But what if that motion had never belonged to you? What if, instead, the movement of your body mirrored the rhythm of a fish's gill flaps, slow and steady, water flowing past delicate tissues that pulled oxygen from liquid itself? Would we see ourselves as graceful, or would we look strange to our own eyes, creatures built not for land but for a constant embrace of water? It's easy to imagine gills carved like thin lines along the neck, fanning slightly with every breath. But perhaps evolution could have chosen something subtler, something woven deeper into the skin, invisible but powerful. Would you notice someone else's breath at all? Or would it be silent, as natural as currents passing over stones? Sometimes I imagine a world where children learn to breathe not with the cry of first air, but with their first gulp of water. The moment of birth would be into a warm tide, lungs already adapted to drink life from liquid. Doesn't that thought carry a kind of strange peace? And how would this reshape the way we move? On land, gravity pulls hard, each step a small struggle. But in water, weight drifts away, muscles loosen, the body remembers a lighter balance. If humanity belonged beneath the waves, would we even keep legs in the form we know? Perhaps they would lengthen into strong fins, or perhaps we would glide with tails, built for distance and quiet swiftness. Or maybe, just maybe, evolution would leave us mostly as we are, clumsy swimmers at first but clever, using tools, shaping the ocean to suit us. Could intelligence itself bend water to our needs, just as it once bent fire and stone on land? If you lived in such a body, would you miss the feeling of air rushing into your lungs? Or would it feel foreign, even frightening, to think of breathing a gas so thin, so dry, compared to the nourishing pull of water? Sometimes I wonder if the surface world would be as unimaginable to these underwater humans as the ocean depths are to us now. A reversed wonder, where the idea of walking in bright sunlight with lungs exposed feels like a dangerous myth. But breathing is not just survival, it shapes everything we do. Consider how sound travels. In air, your voice vibrates quickly, words floating from mouth to ear with crisp edges. In water, sound moves faster, farther, deeper. Our conversations would not be the same. Would we even form words at all, or would we hum and pulse like whales, sending rolling notes that could be felt as much as heard? Maybe our stories would not be spoken but sung, stretched into vibrations carried on currents, drifting like messages in bottles that never need to be written. Would poetry itself change if it were shaped by water instead of air? Think also of our senses. Eyes that see clearly underwater must bend light differently. Would our vision shift toward blues and greens, tuned to faint shimmers and shadow? Would we admire beauty in the faint glow of plankton as much as in the brilliance of stars? And what of touch? In the sea, every movement is pressure, every current a brush of invisible hands. Perhaps we'd read the world not just with eyes but with skin, feeling shifts in water as land dwellers feel wind. Doesn't it feel possible that entire conversations might be held in currents, subtle signals of motion and change? And then there is the question of how we would build. Stone walls and roofs would not rise easily in the sea. Fires would not burn to forge metals. Would we live in caves, in coral palaces grown like gardens, or in vast cities of woven kelp and shell? Perhaps our tools would not be hammers and saws but living creatures, symbiotic allies, glowing jellyfish for lanterns, clams that form our ornaments, sea sponges shaped into bedding. Would our technology be less about conquering and more about partnering, learning to listen to the ocean's own designs? I often wonder whether our sense of time itself would shift. On land, we count the hours by the sun's arc, the rhythm of day and night. But underwater, light bends and fades. The deeper one goes, the less the sky matters. Would we measure life not by hours but by tides, by the moon's pull, by migrations of fish and blooming of plankton? Perhaps our calendars would not mark weeks or months but currents and cycles of the sea. Doesn't that sound slower, gentler, more in tune with the rhythms we ignore above the waves? But questions also linger about what would be lost. Could underwater humanity write at all? Ink on paper would dissolve. Would stories vanish without a way to preserve them? Or would memory grow sharper, tradition stronger, each tale handed down in song or dance, carried by generations like pearls passed along a necklace? Maybe history would not be written in books but in coral carvings, spirals etched into stone where currents would touch them for centuries. Could it be that losing writing would give memory a new power, weaving culture into the very bodies of the people who carried it? And would we, as underwater dwellers, still hunger for the stars? Or would the dark ceiling of the ocean feel enough, dotted with bioluminescent flashes like constellations made of jellyfish and squid? Would myths grow from the lightless depths instead of from the skies, stories told of creatures so vast they shape the tides with a flick of their tails? Perhaps our dreams would look downward, not upward, and the idea of space exploration would seem as absurd as walking on clouds. Yet, I can't help but picture a child of the sea still gazing upward, wondering about the shimmering world above. Maybe curiosity cannot be drowned, no matter how deep it sinks. Would some among us long to climb into the air, to taste it, to stand where birds soar? Would they become the dreamers, inventing strange suits filled with water so they could walk on land as visitors? Isn't it curious to think of reversing the diver's role? Land as the alien realm? Oxygen tanks filled with liquid instead of gas? Helmets heavy with home water so the guild traveler could survive a day among trees? And yet, perhaps such exchange would be rare. The ocean, after all, provides everything: shelter, food, beauty. The surface might seem barren by comparison. Do you think we'd envy it or pity it? Would humans who breathe water see land dwellers as incomplete, fragile, tied to an element too thin to nurture? Or would they look upward with longing, knowing they were bound forever to depths they could never leave? Every turn of this question leads deeper. Not just how we would live, but how we would feel about living. Would breathing underwater make us more patient? After all, the sea teaches slowness. Nothing rushes there. Even predators glide with calm inevitability. Perhaps human culture would mirror that peace, less about speed and urgency, more about drifting in harmony. Or would we still carry ambition, building empires under the waves, competing, conquering, dividing? Is human nature tied to lungs, or does it follow us wherever we go? The thought presses softly, like a tide against the shore. We are already part water. Our blood salt, our cells liquid, the way our bodies float when we surrender to buoyancy. All of it whispers of origins long past. So maybe the difference between us and the imagined water breathers is not so vast. Maybe it is only a turn missed on the road of evolution, a fork never taken. Don't you find comfort in that nearness? The idea that we almost could have been something else? And so the question deepens, not toward answers but toward reflection. What would breathing underwater truly give us? A new body, a new culture, a new way of seeing the world. But perhaps most of all, it would give us a reminder that life is not fixed, that it bends and flows like water itself. We are creatures of chance, shaped by paths taken and paths abandoned. In another reality, we might be gliding silently through the sea at this very moment, breathing liquid with ease, telling stories in currents instead of words. And yet, sitting here with lungs filled by air, we can still close our eyes and imagine. We can still slip, if only in thought, into that other existence. That is its own kind of breathing, a breath not of oxygen, but of wonder. Have you ever thought about how our societies would grow if water was not a boundary but our home? When you picture a city today, perhaps you see tall buildings rising into the sky, roads stretching like veins, and lights glowing in windows at night. But if we were creatures who could breathe the sea, how would we gather? Would our cities cling to the sides of underwater cliffs like coral colonies? Would our homes be round and hollow like seashells, opening into currents that swept through like breezes? What does a neighborhood mean when gravity does not press so firmly? On land, streets keep us ordered, doors divide one family from another, and walls provide a sense of safety. Yet under the sea, movement is free, three-dimensional. You could travel not only left or right, forward or back, but also above and below. Would homes have ceilings at all, or would they be open, shaped like floating gardens where people drifted in and out? Can you imagine a marketplace without stalls or streets, just clusters of humans hovering among baskets of seaweed, exchanging pearls or shells, speaking in songs that echoed through the water? And what would we value in such a world? On land, wood and stone and metal are the skeletons of civilization. But in water, those materials either sink or dissolve. Would we instead turn to coral, coaxing it to grow in patterns we desired, building walls that were alive, colorful, and changing with each year? Would our buildings glow faintly at night, not from fire or wires, but from colonies of bioluminescent plankton carefully tended? It's strange to think that our architects might be gardeners, and our cities less like machines and more like reefs. Wouldn't that blur the line between human creation and nature's own design? If you pause for a moment, you can picture festivals in such a place. Not fireworks, which cannot burn beneath the sea, but vast displays of light made by creatures of the deep. Imagine schools of lanternfish drawn into patterns, their flashing scales weaving living constellations. Or perhaps entire gatherings of people would release clouds of glowing plankton into the water, swirling together until the sea itself shimmered like a galaxy. Doesn't that sound like a celebration that would make the heart slow down in awe, not quicken in noise? But societies are not only about beauty, they are also about survival. How would we defend ourselves against the dangers of the sea? Sharks, squids, creatures larger than us would share the same waters. On land, we built walls and weapons. But underwater, would we instead build alliances? Could dolphins be our allies in watchfulness, their sharp senses warning us of predators? Would we weave nets not for trapping, but for shielding, great curtains of seaweed thick enough to hide a village from view? Or would our best defense be harmony, moving lightly, blending with the ocean's rhythm, never standing out enough to invite attack? And then there is trade. On land, caravans once crossed deserts, ships sailed seas, and now planes cross skies. But in a waterbound world, trade might move with currents. Would merchants ride great turtles, attaching their baskets to shells? Would families carry goods along migratory routes of whales, trusting those giants to guide them safely? Or perhaps trade itself would be slower, patient, shaped by tides rather than clocks. Could it be that our entire economy would breathe in rhythm with the ocean's own tempo, without the rush that rules the dry world? What about art? Would paintings even exist, when paper would dissolve and pigments would drift away? Or would art take other forms? Sculptures of stone smoothed by currents, dances performed in swirls of bodies and bubbles, music made not of sharp notes but of low, humming vibrations that rolled through entire gatherings at once? Imagine sitting quietly as a group of humans sang in harmony under the sea, their voices blending into a sound you didn't just hear. You felt it in your chest, in your skin, in the water around you. Wouldn't that change the way you thought about community, when art was something you literally lived inside? And then I ask myself, what of knowledge? How would we preserve it? Books cannot last underwater, scrolls would melt. Would we carve tablets of stone, heavy and permanent, leaving them to rest in caves? Or would memory itself become the library, with storytellers holding entire histories in their minds, passing them on like living archives? Perhaps families would train children from an early age to remember not only their own lives but the stories of ancestors stretching back hundreds of years. Does that not feel both fragile and strong, like a song carried on but never written down? Of course, societies need leaders. Who would rise to guide underwater people? Would strength matter most, the ability to swim far and fight predators? Or would wisdom, patience, and memory hold greater power? Perhaps leaders would be those who could read the sea best, who understood the tides, the migrations, the subtle signs of storms long before they came. Would politics itself be slower, more measured, shaped by the cycles of the moon instead of the urgency of votes and deadlines? I wonder whether conflict would fade when time itself felt slower, or whether human nature would always find new reasons to divide. Religion, too, would take different forms. On land, many traditions point to the heavens, to skies and stars. But underwater, our eyes would not often see beyond the surface. Would the sacred instead be found in the depths? Would we speak of spirits dwelling in trenches too deep to reach, gods moving in the shapes of whales or shadows of massive squids? Or would the very ocean itself be the divine, a vast living body in which all humans played only a part? I think of how people already describe the sea as eternal, powerful, merciful, and cruel all at once. If we lived within it, wouldn't it feel more like a parent than a resource, more like a god than a backdrop? And then there is love. How would humans court one another in water? Would we gift shells instead of flowers, their spirals carrying secret meanings? Would dances performed together in slow, graceful arcs be signs of affection? Would lovers drift side by side, letting currents bind them closer instead of holding hands? Maybe even the act of sharing breath, of swimming close enough to feel each other's vibrations, would be a form of intimacy. Doesn't it stir something to think of love not in whispers of words, but in ripples of movement, in glowing patterns released into the dark? Children, too, would live differently. On land, first steps are milestones. Underwater, perhaps the first strong swim would carry that meaning. Instead of playgrounds, tidal pools might be their fields, filled with creatures both wondrous and strange. Would they grow fearless, darting among reefs, or cautious, trained to read danger in shifting shadows? I imagine their games might be hide and seek among coral mazes, or races chasing schools of darting fish. Wouldn't that shape a childhood both freer and more bound to nature than ours? And then I return to the question of death. On land, we bury or burn, marking graves with stones. But in the ocean, what would we do? Would we sink our dead into the deep, letting the sea carry them into eternity? Would we build gardens of shells and coral around them, each one a living monument? Or would the idea of a fixed resting place fade, with death becoming not an end but a return, the body dissolving into the very element that sustained life? Could that make grief gentler, when every wave reminded you that those you loved were still part of the sea you swam in? Society, after all, is simply the way we gather, and every element reshapes that gathering. Air gave us fire, fire gave us industry, and industry gave us the world we know. But water, if we could breathe it, would give us something else entirely. Not towers and highways, but gardens and currents. Not speed and clocks, but tides and patience. Do you think such a world would be better or simply different? As the thought lingers, I realize the question is not just about breathing. It is about what breathing allows. The way you take in life, the way you give it back, becomes the foundation for everything built upon it. If we breathed water, the very heart of human life would be shaped by flow, by depth, by silence, by connection. And perhaps, just perhaps, that would lead us to societies that look less like machines and more like living reefs. Intricate, fragile, resilient, endlessly beautiful. Have you ever wondered how time itself would feel if measured not by clocks but by the sea? On land, our lives are divided into minutes and hours, days and weeks, all ticking forward in neat, sharp lines. But underwater, the rhythm changes. Currents move with patience, tides swell and recede with the pull of the moon, and life drifts in cycles that seem slower, deeper, less hurried. If humans lived beneath the waves, would we still measure time in the same way? Or would we surrender to the ocean's own pulse, living not by numbers but by flows and returns? Imagine beginning each day not with the rising sun but with the turning tide. Morning could be the moment when the current shifts toward the shore, and evening when it pulls back to the open sea. Wouldn't life feel more like breathing itself, an endless inhale and exhale, rather than a march toward something final? And what of the seasons? On land, we see them in trees shedding leaves or snow falling on the ground. But underwater, the signs would be subtler. The blooming of plankton, the migrations of whales, the spawning of corals. Perhaps children would learn to mark their birthdays not by dates but by the return of certain fish to their waters, or by the flowering of kelp forests. Wouldn't it give life a sense of being tied more closely to the living world, instead of numbers on a calendar? I sometimes wonder whether people would even age differently if they belonged to the sea. Not the number of years, but the feeling of them. On land, we often rush, each day stacked upon the next like bricks. But in water, where weight is lifted and motion is gentler, might the body hold on to youth longer? Would we feel less pressed by time, our movements stretched and slowed, as if the sea itself softened the urgency of growing old? Could it be that living by tides would give us patience, a kind of calm endurance that land has never taught? And then I ask myself, how would memory work in such a world? Without books to record every hour, without clocks to mark every moment, would we hold the past differently? Perhaps stories would not begin with once upon a time, but with once in the last great tide, or when the whales last returned. Our sense of history might be woven into natural events, each one a marker shared by all. Would that make memory stronger, more collective, less bound to the idea of individual years? Or would it make it blurrier, as if time itself was less rigid and more like a current that carries us without edges? Imagine sitting with elders in an underwater village, listening as they spoke of cycles long past. They might not tell you the year something happened, but instead say, "It was when the coral bloomed brighter than ever before," or "It was the season when the sharks stayed close." Wouldn't that feel like time was a tapestry of living signs, not an abstract number? And what about work? On land, so much of our effort is tied to the hours of a clock, the ringing of alarms, the schedules we follow. But if water were our home, would we labor differently? Perhaps fishing or farming seaweed would happen only when the tide permitted, not when the clock allowed. Maybe entire communities would pause during certain currents, resting when waters grew too strong, working when they calmed. Could it be that work and rest would merge more naturally into the environment, without the sharp divides of workday and weekend? And if life followed this slower rhythm, would our sense of ambition change? On land, there is always a race to earn, to build, to achieve before time runs out. But underwater, where the very act of breathing is tied to patience, would humans become less hurried? Could goals stretch across generations, like coral reefs built layer by layer, not rushed but growing steadily across centuries? Would we become more like gardeners of time, planting seeds we knew we would never see fully bloom? Consider too how art would express time. On land, paintings freeze moments, clocks tick visibly, stories are written to capture what slips away. But in water, perhaps art would flow with time itself. Songs sung in currents would ripple outward, fading gradually but leaving echoes in memory. Sculptures might be built from coral, slowly changing as they grew, each season adding new colors. Maybe even dance would be performed not to mark a single moment, but to blend into the movement of tides, repeated again and again until no one remembered who began it. Wouldn't that make art less about capturing time and more about joining it? But then, would we ever feel the weight of urgency at all? Wouldn't there be dangers in letting time become so fluid? Without deadlines, would invention stall? Without urgency, would progress slow to a crawl? Or is it possible that progress itself would be redefined, not as a race toward the future, but as a deepening of connection with the present? Doesn't it make you wonder whether our obsession with speed is a gift of land and air, or a burden we carry unnecessarily? Even death might be understood differently in such a world. On land, we see lives as finite, measured in years counted carefully. But in water, where everything cycles and returns, death might feel less like an ending and more like a continuation of flow. When someone passed, people might say, "They returned to the tide," or "Their breath has joined the sea." Wouldn't that soften grief, making it less about losing time and more about joining eternity? And love, how would love be shaped by water's sense of time? On land, relationships are often bound by milestones. The first date, the anniversary, the years counted together. But underwater, love might be measured in currents shared, in seasons swum side by side. Instead of celebrating a number of years, perhaps lovers would honor the times they returned to the same migration routes, or the cycles of the moon they drifted together beneath. Wouldn't that make love feel less pressured by time's ticking, more like a timeless tide that ebbs and flows but never ends? I find myself imagining even the simplest daily acts through this lens. Cooking might not be at a fixed hour, but whenever food drifted close, whenever fish schools passed. Sleep might come not in rigid cycles of 8 hours, but in shorter rests, taken whenever currents quieted. Children might not wake to alarms, but to the changing glow of light through the water, learning their rhythms from the sea itself. Could it be that life in water would dissolve not only clocks but the very idea of too late or too soon? And so the question grows larger. What is time really, if not the way we measure change? On land, we see it in shadows and seasons, and we build machines to count it. But underwater, change is slower, more circular, more forgiving. Could living in such a world teach us to see time not as a ladder to climb but as a wave to ride? Wouldn't that reshape everything we know about ourselves, about our goals, about the meaning of living at all? When I let my thoughts drift into this question, I feel a kind of calm curiosity. The idea of time as a tide makes me wonder if maybe, even here on land, we have forgotten how to flow with it. Perhaps the ocean still whispers a truth we once knew, that life is not about racing against the clock, but about moving in rhythm with something larger. And if we had grown with gills instead of lungs, maybe that rhythm would not be forgotten at all. It would be the very breath we lived by. Have you ever asked yourself how our bodies might sound if we lived entirely in water? On land, we are a noisy species. Words tumble from our mouths, songs rise from throats, laughter spills into the air. But in the ocean, sound behaves differently. It travels faster, farther, and deeper, carrying messages through the liquid like invisible threads. If humans had grown to breathe and speak underwater, what kind of language would we have created? Would words as we know them even exist? Think of how muffled your voice sounds when you shout beneath the surface today. The bubbles scatter, and the syllables blur. But perhaps in a world where lungs evolved for water, we would not rely on air pushed past vocal cords at all. Instead, we might hum through our bones, sending vibrations into the sea that others could feel as well as hear. Imagine communication as a ripple across skin, a resonance in the chest, a vibration along the arms. Wouldn't that make words feel more intimate, as if language touched you physically rather than hovering in the air around you? And if words dissolved into vibrations, what would poetry become? Maybe poems would be less about rhymes and more about rhythms, long pulses and soft tremors weaving together like music. Lovers might exchange songs not in secret whispers but in currents, sending waves that only the other could sense. Wouldn't that change what it means to keep a secret when your feelings could be carried directly by your body? I often wonder what our songs would sound like. Dolphins and whales already sing in the ocean, their calls stretching across miles, echoing in ways we barely understand. Could humans join that choir? Perhaps our voices would be tuned lower, slower, resonating with the depth of water. Entire villages might hum together, their songs rolling like tides, surrounding everyone in sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Can you imagine a festival where the sea itself seemed to sing because so many voices joined as one? And what of silence? On land, silence is often complete, broken only by a breeze or a distant bird. But underwater, there is always sound. The crackle of shrimp, the groan of shifting rocks, the endless whisper of currents. In such a world, would silence ever exist? Or would peace mean something else? Not the absence of sound, but the blending of every sound into a hum so steady you no longer noticed it? Would humans learn to listen differently, paying attention not to what is loud but to what is subtle, like the faint pattern of a friend's heartbeat carried through the water? But language is not only about sound. It is also about gesture, about expression. And water would shape that too. Every movement beneath the sea leaves a trail of bubbles, a shift in current, a ripple. Would our bodies themselves become words, speaking through the sweep of a hand or the tilt of a head? Entire conversations might be held through swirls of movement, so fluid that outsiders could never translate them. Could it be that our very swimming would become a form of grammar? And then I wonder, would writing exist at all? On land, writing freezes words so they can outlive the speaker. But ink dissolves in water, paper melts, and fire never burns. Perhaps writing would take new forms. Carvings into stone, etched deep enough to last. Patterns of shells arranged carefully along the seafloor. Coral gardens grown into shapes that held stories in their curves. Could an epic tale be told not in lines of text but in a reef sculpted across generations? Every branching coral another chapter? Doesn't that feel like memory itself might be alive, growing, shifting, refusing to stay static? Think of children learning to speak in such a world. Instead of babbling words, perhaps they would practice little pulses of vibration, short bursts of humming that slowly became patterns others recognized. Families would lean close, listening not with ears but with entire bodies, until the child's first word rippled through the water like a small wave. Wouldn't that feel magical, a birth of language not in sound but in touch? And if communication were so different, what about lies? On land, we hide behind words, twisting them, bending them. But if underwater language was tied to vibration and movement, could deception even exist? Wouldn't emotions show themselves in the very rhythm of your hum, the pattern of your ripples? Maybe humans would grow more transparent, less able to disguise what they felt. Would societies shaped by such honesty be gentler, less suspicious? Or would new forms of deception emerge, subtler ones, teaching us again how to hide? Then there is the matter of long-distance talk. On land, we built messengers, then letters, then phones. But in the ocean, sound carries so far already. Would we even need such tools? Imagine calling to a friend miles away, your hum traveling across valleys of water until it reached them. Perhaps whole communities would stay linked through vast songs, their voices weaving together across great distances. Wouldn't that blur the line between self and society, when your own voice became part of a chorus larger than you could ever see? But questions unfold endlessly. What about storytelling? Around fires, humans once told tales, their voices shaping myths in the dark. Without fire, without dry air, how would myths survive? Perhaps they would be sung in long, low notes passed down for centuries, each generation adding new verses. Or perhaps stories would be danced, whole bodies weaving meaning through patterns in the sea. Could it be that our most ancient myths would exist not as words at all, but as movements remembered in the muscles of dancers, repeated across lifetimes? And what would theater look like? On land, actors use stages, curtains, spotlights. But underwater, imagine performers moving through glowing clouds of plankton, their gestures scattering light in ways that told the story. Audiences would not sit in chairs but float around, circling the dancers, part of the performance themselves. Wouldn't that erase the boundary between watcher and actor, turning all of society into participants in its stories? There's also a deeper question. If humans spoke through vibrations, through touch and hum, how would thought itself change? Language shapes the way we think. On land, words are linear, one after the other. But vibrations can overlap, chords building together, harmonies holding many meanings at once. Could it be that our minds themselves would become more layered, less bound to straight lines, more capable of holding several truths together? Might we grow comfortable with ambiguity, with meaning that shifted like waves rather than standing fixed like stone? And then I wonder about prayer. Many religions today speak of voices raised to the heavens, words carried upward. But in an underwater world, prayer might be directed downward, into the depths, or outward into the currents. People might hum softly into the sea, their voices blending with others until the whole community's devotion became one great vibration carried across miles. Wouldn't that make prayer less about one voice seeking the divine, and more about many voices joining in the ocean itself? Yet there is always the shadow of misunderstanding. On land, language divides us, different tongues, accents, dialects. Would the same happen underwater? Would communities develop their own rhythms, patterns, and vibrations that others could not understand? Would strangers sound alien to one another, their hums jarring, their movements confusing? Or would the ocean's vastness demand unity, pressing us toward a more universal tongue? Which feels more likely to you, that the sea unites or that it fragments just as land has done? Even now, when we dive into the water for only a moment, we get a taste of this difference. Our voices falter, our gestures blur. And yet, isn't there something soothing about letting sound melt into vibration, about communicating less with words and more with presence? Perhaps the dream of underwater speech isn't just a fantasy of biology but a reminder of a gentler way to connect, a way that listens with more than ears, that speaks with more than mouths. So I return to the question, if humans could breathe underwater, how would we speak? Would we hum like whales, shimmer like fish, or ripple like currents? Would we write with coral, sing with tides, tell stories with light? The answer may never be certain, but the wondering itself feels like a song, slow, steady, full of echoes. And maybe that is enough, to imagine our voices carried not by air, but by the sea, endless, unbroken, eternal. Have you ever thought about how food would shape our lives if water were our true home? On land, so much of culture is built around the harvest of fields, the keeping of livestock, the warmth of fire. But in the ocean, the ingredients change. Wheat cannot grow in the salt, fire cannot burn, and herds cannot graze. If humans had always lived beneath the sea, what would we eat, and how would our meals bind us together? Imagine for a moment a vast kelp forest swaying gently in the current. To us now, it is a place of mystery, a shelter for fish, a cradle for life. But to underwater people, wouldn't it be a field, just as golden wheat is to us? Families might swim among the long green fronds, gathering tender leaves, storing them in woven baskets made of seagrass. Perhaps kelp would be our bread, the staple at the heart of every meal, dried in the warmth of shallow waters or pressed into sheets like paper. Would children grow up with the taste of seaweed as familiar as bread is to us now? And then there are shellfish, oysters, clams, mussels, all creatures that already filter the sea into food. Wouldn't humans learn to farm them as carefully as farmers tend cows and sheep? Picture entire reefs turned into oyster gardens, shimmering with pearls that formed as natural byproducts of food. Would meals be both nourishment and beauty, a balance of necessity and art? Fish, too, would still play a part. But would we catch them with nets and hooks as we do now? Or would that feel too much like hunting kin, creatures who shared our water, our world? Maybe instead we would learn to herd them, guiding schools of fish with gentle walls of kelp, raising them like shepherds raise flocks. Can you imagine whole communities working together to guide shimmering rivers of silver fish through the sea, not as predators but as caretakers? And what of the creatures larger than us, the whales, the dolphins, the turtles? Would they be companions, allies, perhaps even sacred beings? On land, humans once relied on animals for work, for carrying loads and pulling plows. But underwater, those roles might belong to great turtles who carried baskets on their shells, or dolphins who helped drive fish toward our villages. Would the act of eating such creatures feel like betrayal, or would reverence itself prevent it? Cooking poses an even stranger question. Without fire, how would meals transform? Perhaps we would not cook at all, learning instead to enjoy the flavors of the sea as they are. Or maybe we would discover other methods, fermenting kelp in stone chambers, using the sun in shallow lagoons to dry food, or even harnessing the heat of undersea vents. Can you picture entire feasts prepared near volcanic springs, the water itself bubbling with warmth, turning meals into celebrations of the Earth's own fire beneath the sea? But food is more than sustenance. It is ritual, memory, connection. On land, we gather around tables. Underwater, perhaps we would gather in circles, drifting together as baskets of seaweed and shellfish passed from hand to hand. Instead of cups of wine, perhaps we would share glowing plankton in small shells, their light turning a meal into a kind of soft ceremony. Wouldn't that make dining less about filling hunger and more about being present with one another? Festivals, too, would be marked by food. Imagine a yearly migration of fish so vast that entire oceans darkened with their bodies. To us now, it is a spectacle of nature. But to underwater humans, it might be a time of joy and abundance, when families swam together to gather what they needed, singing songs to mark the season. Wouldn't feasts become stories themselves, each one remembered not for the dishes served but for the tides and migrations that made them possible? And what about taste? Our tongues now know salt, but underwater, surrounded by it, would we even notice? Would we crave sweetness instead, found in rare fruits that drifted down rivers into the sea, or in the sap of seagrass pressed into nectar? Maybe bitterness, too, would carry new meaning, a reminder of the wild plants of the deep. Would our sense of flavor be broader, more tied to texture and vibration than to taste alone? Then comes the question of scarcity. On land, droughts and famines shaped history. Underwater, scarcity would come not from dry soil but from changing currents, from warming seas, from coral bleaching. Would humans learn to migrate as fish do, following abundance across vast distances? Or would we plant ourselves in places where food was steady, cultivating the sea as carefully as land farmers tend their soil? Could hunger itself drive invention, pushing people to new ways of farming the ocean? Or would patience, once again, be the answer, waiting for cycles to return, trusting that the sea provides in time? I find myself imagining trade shaped by taste. Communities in shallow coral waters might send kelp to those in the open sea, while deep-dwelling groups offered rare fish in return. Pearls, bright and delicate, might serve as both decoration and currency, proof that a meal had been harvested and shared. Could an entire economy arise from food itself, measured not in gold but in nourishment? And how would meals mark milestones? On land, birthdays and weddings are honored with cakes, with banquets, with toasts. Underwater, perhaps lovers would exchange shells filled with rare fruits, or families would dive together into the depths to gather a particular kind of glowing fish for celebration. The act of eating itself would become a ritual of love, a language of belonging. Doesn't that feel like food could become even more sacred than it is now? But food is also survival, and survival often comes with conflict. On land, wars have been fought over land and grain. Would underwater humans fight over reefs and fishing grounds? Or would the vastness of the ocean make conflict less common? Perhaps territories would be marked not by walls but by the patterns of coral cultivated there. Would humans defend these living boundaries fiercely? Or would the constant movement of the sea teach us to share more freely? And then there is the matter of spirit. In so many human cultures, meals are tied to the sacred bread broken in worship, feasts shared in celebration, fasts kept in reverence. What would that look like in a water-bound world? Perhaps entire ceremonies would revolve around the gathering of plankton blooms, glowing like stars beneath the waves. To eat such light might feel holy, as though one were swallowing pieces of the cosmos itself. Would prayer and eating merge into a single act, Each meal a reminder that life is sustained by the ocean's infinite gift? I wonder, too, about how children would learn to value food. Would they dive with parents to collect oysters, learning patience as they pried shells open with careful hands? Would they weave baskets from sea grasses, their first clumsy attempts becoming treasures in family memory? Perhaps they would learn early the difference between hunger and abundance, not as fear but as part of the rhythm of tides. Wouldn't that shape a deeper gratitude, one not tied to possession but to cycles? And finally, I think of feasting not as filling the belly, but as a celebration of connection. Imagine drifting in a circle of family and friends, passing baskets of kelp, sharing glowing shells, humming songs that ripple outward into the sea. Around you, the ocean continues its eternal rhythm, a reminder that all food, all life, is drawn from its depths. Wouldn't every meal carry the weight of gratitude, a quiet recognition that breathing and eating alike are gifts from the same endless water? So the question remains, what would food mean if humans lived in the sea? Perhaps it would mean more than survival. It would mean cycles, connection, reverence, memory. It would mean seeing nourishment not as something conquered or owned, but as something shared, gifted, flowing through us like tides. And maybe that, more than anything, would reshape not just what we eat but who we are. Have you ever wondered how we would explore if the ocean were not a boundary but our home? On land, humans have always carried an urge to wander, to climb mountains, to cross deserts, to sail seas. But if we were creatures of water, breathing it as easily as air, where would our journeys take us? Would the idea of exploration look the same, or would it transform into something stranger, deeper, more infinite? The sea itself invites curiosity. Even now, though we cannot breathe beneath it, we dive and send machines into its depths. But those efforts are brief, clumsy, limited. Imagine if every human body were already built for the deep. Wouldn't the entire ocean be open to us, from the bright coral gardens of the shallows to the trenches where sunlight has never touched? Exploration would no longer mean leaving the sea but venturing further into it, into realms where even today our knowledge remains thin as mist. Think of the first explorers in such a world. On land, early humans followed rivers, crossed mountains, and mapped the stars. But underwater, perhaps the explorers would follow whale migrations, letting those giants guide them into the unknown. Perhaps they would drift into trenches, where pressure grew crushing, discovering ways to endure the weight of water. Wouldn't these journeys carry not only danger but wonder, each new depth a revelation of creatures and landscapes unseen? And what tools would they carry? On land, explorers took compasses, fire, and maps. Underwater, a compass would still point north, but how would one draw a map in a world where directions are not flat but three-dimensional? Would maps become spheres of woven coral, with routes marked by threads and shells? Could explorers leave behind trails of glowing algae, like lanterns marking a path, guiding others into places where no human had swum before? And then there are the mysteries of the deep. Even now, we barely know what lives below. If humans lived in water, perhaps our explorers would find forests of tube worms at volcanic vents, creatures glowing with their own light, fish with jaws like traps. Would these be recorded as discoveries, or as omens, myths, and sacred beings? Perhaps entire legends would rise from the deep, tales of monsters too vast to see in full, their bodies like living continents moving through darkness. Wouldn't exploration itself become inseparable from myth, every new trench or cave carrying whispers of gods or spirits? But exploration is not only about discovery. It is also about trade, migration, connection. Imagine humans spreading not across continents but through seas, building networks of coral cities linked by currents. Travel would not be by ship but by long swims, aided by currents that served as highways. Wouldn't it be extraordinary to think of people navigating not by stars above but by the feel of tides, the hum of distant whale songs, the faint pull of the moon through the sea? What dangers would explorers face? Pressure, cold, predators, these would all shape courage differently. On land, explorers fear storms, hunger, thirst. Underwater, the dangers would be quieter but more constant. A shift in current could carry you into endless drift. A sudden predator could emerge from the dark. A cave might collapse, leaving no exit. Wouldn't bravery itself take on new meaning, defined not by conquering the land but by trusting the sea, surrendering to its unpredictability? And then I wonder, would humans ever feel the need to leave the water entirely? If we could breathe beneath the waves, would the stars still call to us? Or would the deep sea itself be vast enough, infinite enough, to satisfy our hunger for mystery? Perhaps space exploration as we know it would never exist. Perhaps the ocean, with its depths unexplored, would be the cosmos we studied for eternity. Wouldn't it be strange if our most daring explorers never looked up at the sky, but always downward, into the blue-black unknown? Yet exploration is not just physical. It is also about ideas, about pushing the edges of what is known. If humans had lived in water, how would philosophy itself be shaped by exploration? On land, philosophers gaze at the sky asking about infinity. Underwater, perhaps they would gaze into darkness, asking what lay beyond the reach of light. Maybe exploration itself would be seen as a spiritual act, a way of touching the divine by venturing into the ocean's deepest mysteries. Could journeys themselves become prayers, the explorer not just a discoverer but a pilgrim? And think of art inspired by exploration. On land, we paint mountains and skies. We write stories of heroes crossing deserts. Underwater, art might celebrate the unknown depths. Sculptures of fish no one had yet seen. Songs mimicking the calls of distant whales. Dances telling of currents that carried people to new worlds. Wouldn't exploration itself fuel creativity? Each new discovery becoming a story told in rhythm and song, woven into the collective memory of a people who could never truly stop wandering? But exploration also brings change, sometimes too quickly. On land, new lands were conquered, ecosystems altered, cultures displaced. Would underwater exploration carry the same risks? If one group discovered a rich reef, would others rush to claim it? Would conflict arise, not over borders drawn in soil, but over coral gardens and fishing grounds? Or would the ocean's constant movement make ownership impossible, forcing people to share by necessity? Doesn't the sea itself resist being claimed, always shifting, always flowing? And then there's the question of tools. Would underwater explorers build machines as we have built ships and planes? Perhaps giant living constructs, whales fitted with harnesses, jellyfish guided by humans, would become vessels of exploration. Or perhaps technology would be alive itself, reefs grown into vehicles, shells shaped into tools. Would exploration be mechanical or organic, or some strange blend of both? And what of children? On land, they dream of becoming astronauts, travelers of the stars. Underwater, what would they dream of? Perhaps becoming deep diverse, heroes who swim into trenches so dark that even light cannot follow. Perhaps their bedtime stories would not be of dragons or spaceships, but of strange glowing fish and endless abysses. Wouldn't childhood itself be shaped by exploration? Every tide pool a first adventure, every migration a chance to see a wider world? I think too of memory. Exploration is remembered in journals, in maps, in photographs. But underwater, memory might be carried in song, in coral carvings, in stories passed down. Each explorer's tale might be sung at gatherings, the hum of their voice blending with the community, so that no one person owned the story but all shared in it. Wouldn't exploration feel less like individual glory and more like a gift to all? And yet, there would still be dreamers who longed for more. Even if the sea were vast enough to hold us, some would still wonder what lay above. Perhaps a rare few explorers would break through the surface, breathing the air not as a necessity but as an adventure. Wouldn't they seem almost mythical to others? Humans who dared the alien world of land, with its dry skies, its winds, its stars? Could land itself become the final frontier for a people who lived their whole lives in water? So exploration, in this imagined humanity, would not end. It would only change direction. Instead of looking up, we would look down. Instead of crossing continents, we would drift through currents. Instead of mapping stars, we would chart trenches. And every discovery would remind us not of our mastery over the world, but of its endlessness, its mystery, its refusal to ever be fully known. Perhaps that is the lesson hiding in this question. Exploration is not about reaching an end. It is about deepening our relationship with the unknown. Whether through deserts, skies, seas, or stars, humans will always wonder, always wander. And if our bodies were shaped for water, then the ocean itself would be our cosmos, infinite and eternal. Wouldn't it be beautiful to live in a world where exploration was not about conquest but about communion? Not about claiming but about listening, not about finishing but about beginning again, with every tide, every depth, every unknown horizon beneath the waves. Have you ever thought about how humans would dream if our lives were lived entirely in water? On land, dreams are shaped by air and gravity, by firelight and shadows, by the rhythm of footsteps and the press of solid ground. But under the sea, the body floats. The world is quieter, dimmer, more fluid. Wouldn't our dreams be different too, shaped by the sway of currents and the endless echo of the deep? Sleep itself would change. On land, we lie on beds, pressed by weight into rest. In water, where would we sleep? Perhaps we would drift among soft sea grasses, swaying with the tide, our bodies rising and falling with each pull of the moon. Or maybe we would curl into coral hollows, sheltered from predators, cradled by stone and sponge. Imagine closing your eyes as gentle bubbles slipped from your lips, drifting upward like lanterns while the sea cradled you in its arms. Couldn't that make sleep feel less like shutting off the world and more like dissolving into it? And what of dreams? Would they still be filled with flight, as they so often are for us now? Perhaps instead they would be filled with journeys downward, plunging deeper and deeper into endless caverns, or soaring upward through shafts of sunlight breaking the surface. Wouldn't our inner imaginations mirror the ocean around us, carrying us into visions of glowing fish, forests of kelp taller than mountains, and creatures that only appear in the corners of memory? Some say dreams are ways for the mind to untangle thoughts. If that is true, wouldn't underwater dreams be full of tides and cycles, weaving problems and answers together like the ebb and flow of waves? Imagine a person troubled in waking life, uncertain of a choice. In their dream, perhaps they would find themselves pulled by two currents, one strong and rushing, the other slow and winding. Wouldn't the sea itself give shape to their decision, offering meaning in the way water carried them? I wonder if entire cultures would grow around the interpretation of dreams. On land, people once read dreams as omens, messages from gods. In water, perhaps dreams would be treated as tides within the mind, signs of how well one lived in harmony with the sea. A dream of darkness might be seen as a warning of imbalance, while a dream of glowing creatures could be taken as blessing. Wouldn't elders gather the young to share dreams, weaving them into stories that bound communities closer? And then there are nightmares. On land, nightmares chase us with fire, with falling, with suffocation. But underwater, what would terrify us most? Perhaps the dream of a current pulling us where we could not escape. Perhaps shadows too vast to name passing just beyond sight. Or silence so deep that even one's own heartbeat could not be heard. Wouldn't nightmares themselves reflect the sea's power, its capacity to cradle or consume? Dreams might also connect us. Imagine sleeping near others, your vibrations and hums mingling as you drifted together. Could dreams overlap, blending into shared visions? Would people wake and tell one another they had seen the same reef, the same glowing creature, the same vast trench? If so, would dreams become more than personal? They would be communal, a realm where the whole society met in the night. Doesn't that feel like a mystery both comforting and uncanny? And what about art inspired by dreams? On land, painters capture dream visions, writers weave them into stories. Underwater, perhaps dream-inspired coral sculptures would rise, reefs shaped into the creatures people saw while asleep. Entire songs might be built from dream journeys, sung in deep, rolling notes that echoed the strangeness of night. Wouldn't dreams themselves become a wellspring of creativity, blurring the line between imagination and reality? Children, too, would dream differently. For them, the sea would not yet be fully known, its depths still filled with wonder and fear. Their dreams might be wild, filled with impossible creatures stitched together from fragments of their waking lives. A dolphin with the wings of a ray. A kelp forest that spoke with a human voice. Would parents tell them these were nonsense? Or would they listen closely, believing children's dreams carried truths adults had forgotten? Could it be that the most powerful myths of a people would begin in the dreams of the young? And I cannot help but ask, what would it mean to dream of land if we were ocean dwellers? Would a vision of walking upright, breathing air, and gazing at stars be seen as fantasy, a strange, impossible tale? Perhaps such dreams would inspire curiosity, even reverence. Could they become holy visions, stories of another world that only appeared in sleep? Would people tell of the dry realm, glimpsed only in dreams, a place of trees and birds and sky? Might it be treated as a heaven or a parallel existence, forever out of reach? Dreams often blur boundaries between self and world. On land, we dream of becoming animals, of flying, of turning into something beyond human. In water, might we dream of merging with currents, of becoming waves, of dissolving into light itself? Wouldn't such dreams carry spiritual weight, teaching people to see themselves not as separate from the ocean but as part of its endless body? Perhaps the highest form of dream would be one where the dreamer ceased to exist, flowing into the sea entirely, returning to its vastness. And how would healers use dreams? On land, some cultures believed illnesses came from troubled spirits and could be cured by guiding the dreamer. In water, perhaps healers would listen carefully to a person's dreams, finding in them signs of imbalance, currents that pulled too strongly, shadows that lingered too long. Would healing come not from herbs or tools, but from guiding the dreamer into new dreams, helping them imagine balance, light, and flow? What of love, shaped by dreams? Lovers might dream of swimming together through endless caverns, of glowing fish circling them like stars. They might wake and believe their bond was destined, sealed not by vows but by visions. Could entire marriages be arranged around dreams, the belief that seeing another in the dream world meant their lives were meant to intertwine? Wouldn't that blur the line between waking choice and sleeping fate? And then there are collective dreams. Imagine a whole community sleeping during a calm tide, their bodies drifting side by side. If dreams truly overlapped, perhaps they would share one vast vision. A reef filled with light, a creature guiding them, a voice of the ocean itself. Upon waking, they would all remember the same thing, treating it as a message too large for any one person. Wouldn't that bind the society closer, giving them shared purpose shaped not by laws but by visions of the night? But questions always remain. Do dreams guide us, or do we guide them? Are they reflections of the sea around us, or of the sea within us? If we were humans who breathed water, would our dreams simply echo what we already knew? Or would they show us what lay beyond, things we could never touch but could only imagine? Could it be that dreaming itself would become the true act of exploration, the mind diving where the body could not? I like to think that if we lived in such a world, dreams would be treated with tenderness. Each morning, families would ask one another not "What did you do yesterday?" but "Where did you swim last night?" Dreams would not be forgotten fragments but honored journeys, each one carrying meaning. Wouldn't that make even sleep feel purposeful, a continuation of life rather than a pause from it? And perhaps the greatest comfort would be this: even if death came, even if a life ended, people might believe the soul continued to dream forever. Not lost, not gone, but dreaming endlessly in the currents of the sea. The afterlife itself could be seen as one long, infinite dream, where the sleeper finally merged fully with the ocean's eternal body. Doesn't that thought carry a softness, a gentleness, like water itself wrapping around you? So I return to the question, how would humans dream if we lived in the sea? Perhaps our nights would be filled with visions of light and depth, of creatures and currents, of journeys beyond waking life. Perhaps dreams would guide us, unite us, inspire us, and remind us that even in rest, we belong to something larger. And maybe, just maybe, dreams would become the truest form of breathing. An inhale of mystery, an exhale of wonder, carrying us deeper into the ocean of ourselves. Have you ever wondered how humans would understand death if we had lived our whole existence in water? On land, death is tied to soil, to fire, to burial beneath the earth or return to ash and smoke. Rituals are built on the solidity of ground and the rising of flame. But under the sea, the world is softer, quieter, more fluid. How would we say goodbye in a realm where nothing truly stays still, where all things drift, dissolve, and return to the currents? Imagine a body released into the tide. It does not rest in a grave, but becomes part of the ocean itself. Small fish circle, corals take hold. The body feeds life even as life departs. Wouldn't that make death feel less like an end and more like a transformation? A passage from one form to another, just as water itself changes shape but never disappears. Could grief feel gentler if every farewell was also a reminder of how life continues in new forms? What would funerals look like in such a world? Perhaps families would gather in circles, drifting around the body, humming low songs that carried through the water. Instead of firelight, glowing plankton might be released, surrounding the departed in halos of blue. Or maybe shells would be placed gently around them, creating a cradle that would drift into the depths. Wouldn't rituals themselves become more fluid, less about permanence and more about letting go? And what of memory? On land, we carve names in stone, mark graves, build monuments. In water, stone erodes, coral grows, currents erase sharp lines. Would we still try to mark a place, or would we accept that all places change? Perhaps memory would not be carved into things, but sung into stories, each person remembered in the vibrations of song, carried across generations. Wouldn't remembrance feel more alive that way, less fixed, more like the ongoing current of the ocean itself? I think of how children would learn about death. On land, children are often shielded from it, stories softened or delayed. But underwater, where life and death are so entwined, perhaps children would witness it early. Fish eaten by larger fish, coral bleaching and returning, a body drifting into the current. Wouldn't that teach them not to fear it as something strange, but to see it as part of the ocean's endless rhythm? Could it be that their first lessons about death would be lessons about connection, about cycles, about return? And what of ancestors? On land, we honor them with shrines, with graves, with relics. In water, perhaps ancestors would be remembered through places they once swam, through songs they once sang. Would families return to the same reefs, saying, "This was where our grandmother harvested kelp, where our grandfather sang his deepest songs"? Could memory be tied not to objects but to living places, woven into the sea itself? Death often brings fear, yet I wonder, would it feel less frightening in a world where breathing itself was a reminder of cycles? Every tide flows in and out, every wave rises and falls. If our bodies lived in rhythm with that, wouldn't death feel like just another tide, another current to follow? Perhaps people would even speak of it as the Great Drift, a journey into waters beyond sight. Could such language make the unknown less terrifying, even beautiful? And what of the soul? On land, beliefs often send it upward, to heavens, to skies, to stars. But underwater, would the soul be imagined as flowing downward, into the deepest trenches where mystery dwells? Or outward, dissolving into the currents that touch every shore? Perhaps people would believe that souls become the very sounds of the sea, the hum of whales, the crackle of coral, the endless whisper of tide against stone. Wouldn't that make every sound a reminder of those who came before, every current a touch from the departed? Rituals might grow rich around these beliefs. Some communities could release glowing shells, letting them drift away like lanterns in the current. Others might carve coral in memory of the lost, knowing that living reef would carry their presence forward. Wouldn't each tradition mirror the ocean's own nature, never fixed, always shifting, yet always alive? And grief itself, how would it look underwater? On land, grief often gathers in tears, in sobs, in silence. In water, tears dissolve, voices hum instead of cry. Would grief be shown through long, low vibrations that echoed the weight of loss? Could communities gather not in silence but in shared humming, letting their sorrow ripple outward, felt by every body nearby? Wouldn't grief become less private, more collective, a wave carried together rather than alone? I wonder too about myths. On land, stories of death often involve journeys. Across rivers, through underworlds into skies. In water, myths might tell of souls traveling through endless caverns, following glowing creatures into the deep. Perhaps people would believe that at death, one is guided by a whale or a ray, escorted to places no living human can follow. Wouldn't that make death itself feel like an exploration, a voyage into mystery? But what of those left behind? Would they fear the sea that took their loved ones, or would they trust it as a keeper, a caretaker? Perhaps they would visit the same currents, hoping to feel the presence of the departed in the brush of water against their skin. Could the sea itself become the graveyard and the temple, both the place of farewell and the place of connection? And then there is the question of eternity. On land, people imagine eternal heavens, eternal flames, eternal rest. Underwater, where nothing is still, could eternity mean something else? Not stillness, but endless change. Perhaps people would not hope for eternal rest, but for eternal return, becoming part of fish, coral, currents, rain that falls back to sea. Wouldn't that make eternity less distant, more immediate, already present in every breath of water? What about love that outlasts death? On land, people keep rings, letters, belongings. Underwater, perhaps lovers would carve coral together, knowing it would grow long after they were gone. Or they would hum songs only they knew, passed down so descendants would still hear echoes of their bond. Could grief itself become less about clinging and more about flowing, letting love continue as part of the sea's endless music? And finally, I wonder, would we even speak of death as separate from life? On land, we draw a line, alive then gone. But in the ocean, where every creature feeds another, where every current recycles, would life and death be one? Perhaps people would say not they have died, but they have joined the tide. Wouldn't that language reshape how we feel about our own endings, turning fear into something closer to peace? So the question lingers, soft but steady. How would humans understand death if we belonged to the sea? Perhaps as transformation, as return, as communion with something larger. Perhaps as drift, as exploration, as song. Maybe we would still grieve, still ache, still miss, but we would also see every wave as proof that nothing is truly gone. And maybe, just maybe, death would no longer feel like the end of breathing, but simply a new way of breathing, through the ocean itself, forever. Have you ever asked yourself what it would mean to find purpose if humanity had lived its whole story beneath the sea? On land, purpose often grows from conquest, invention, and progress, building towers, reaching skies, mastering fire and machines. But in the ocean, where everything flows and nothing truly stands still, would our sense of meaning be the same? Or would it take on gentler shapes, tied less to permanence and more to harmony with the endless rhythm of water? Consider what it means to leave a legacy. On land, people build monuments, write books, leave behind objects that resist time. In water, stone erodes, paper dissolves, metals rust. Would legacy instead be woven into living things? Reefs shaped by careful tending, songs passed through generations, stories carried in currents? Wouldn't that make purpose feel less about standing apart from nature and more about becoming part of it, guiding its flow rather than defying it? What about ambition? On land, ambition is often measured in speed, who can build fastest, rise highest, discover first. But beneath the waves, where pressure is patient and coral takes centuries to grow, would ambition slow? Perhaps it would stretch across lifetimes, like a reef tended by many generations, each one adding their layer. Could purpose itself become less about individual achievement and more about collective continuity, each person contributing to something larger than themselves? And then there is knowledge. On land, knowledge is gathered in libraries, in written words, in digital archives. Underwater, where such things dissolve, how would wisdom endure? Perhaps knowledge would be remembered through story, sung into vibrations, carved into coral patterns. Maybe entire communities would carry shared libraries of memory within themselves, each voice a piece of the whole. Wouldn't that make knowledge less about ownership and more about community, a treasure that belonged to all, not one. Think of spirituality, too. On land, many religions look upward, to heavens and skies, to stars burning in vast silence. But in the sea, the divine might be found downward, in the dark trenches where mystery reigns, or outward, in the ceaseless currents that touch every shore. Could purpose be seen not as reaching for what is above, but as flowing with what already surrounds us? Perhaps the highest meaning would come not from leaving the world, but from deepening our place within it. Wouldn't that shift the very axis of belief, turning salvation into harmony, turning transcendence into immersion? And love, wouldn't love itself shape purpose? On land, we speak of building homes, families, futures. In water, perhaps love would mean drifting side by side, raising children who learned to swim before they walked, tending gardens of kelp and coral together. Could it be that the simplest bonds, sharing breath, sharing song, sharing journeys through the sea, would carry more meaning than conquest or glory? Wouldn't that make purpose not something sought in distance, but something discovered in presence? But what of exploration? Even in water, humans would still long for the unknown. Would the greatest purpose be to descend into depths unseen, to follow whales into mystery, to chart caverns no light has touched? Or would exploration itself be seen as service to the community, bringing back not trophies but understanding, weaving discoveries into the shared story of the people? Could purpose itself become the act of wonder, of never ceasing to ask questions, of never exhausting curiosity? And then there is the question of art. On land, art often strives for permanence. A painting on canvas, a sculpture of stone, a building that stands for centuries. In the sea, art might be designed to change, to dissolve, to flow. Coral sculptures that grow and shift, songs that echo once and vanish, dances performed in glowing clouds of plankton that fade as quickly as they appear. Wouldn't purpose in art become less about lasting forever and more about touching deeply, even if only for a moment? Could impermanence itself be the meaning? Children, too, would shape purpose. Imagine a child learning their first song of the sea, their first dive into a kelp forest, their first encounter with creatures of the deep. Perhaps purpose would be measured in what we pass to the next generation. Not possessions, but skills, songs, ways of listening. Wouldn't raising children in such a world feel less about guiding them toward achievement and more about teaching them to live gently, to flow with what already exists? And what of conflict? On land, purpose often becomes tangled with power. Rulers seeking dominion, nations seeking expansion. Would underwater humanity fall into the same patterns? Or would the sea itself discourage such ambitions, its vastness reminding us how small we are? Perhaps purpose would not lie in control but in balance, in keeping harmony with currents, in ensuring no reef or migration was destroyed. Wouldn't the ocean itself resist our attempts to dominate it, teaching us humility in every storm, every tide? I imagine rituals of purpose, ceremonies that gave shape to meaning. On land, we mark adulthood with celebrations, crowns, or titles. In water, perhaps a young person's purpose would be recognized when they completed their first long migration, following whales across vast distances, or when they tended their first coral garden, adding to the living legacy of their people. Couldn't purpose become less about claiming identity and more about joining the larger rhythm, proving oneself part of the sea's endless cycle? And then I ask myself, what would happen when purpose was lost? On land, we speak of despair, of emptiness. Underwater, perhaps such feelings would be met with patience. Elders might say, "You are simply caught in a still current. Wait, and the tide will carry you again." Wouldn't that make purpose feel less fragile, less easily broken, more like something that ebbs and returns as naturally as waves? What about aging? On land, many fear growing old, as if life loses meaning when strength fades. But underwater, where movement is softened by buoyancy, where elders can still drift and hum, might old age carry different purpose? Perhaps elders would be the keepers of memory, the singers of deepest songs, the guides of dreams. Couldn't purpose in old age be more visible, more honored, more celebrated than on land? And finally, I wonder about the great question. Why live at all? On land, philosophers have searched for answers in struggle, in creation, in eternity. Underwater, perhaps the answer would be simpler, softer. To live would mean to breathe with the tide, to flow with the sea, to add one's voice to the great song of currents and creatures. Wouldn't purpose itself be less about what we achieve and more about how we belong, how we fit into the endless, flowing, shimmering whole? So perhaps the truest purpose, if we were beings of the sea, would not be conquest, not permanence, not glory. It would be presence. To live fully in each current, to share each song, to drift together in wonder. Purpose would not be a mountain to climb, but a wave to join, a tide to follow, an ocean to embrace. And maybe, just maybe, even here on land, that is the lesson waiting beneath the question. That purpose is not in racing ahead, but in listening, in belonging, in breathing with the world around us. That whether we breathe air or water, we are always part of something larger, something flowing, something eternal. Wouldn't it be beautiful if we remembered that truth, not as fantasy, but as the deepest reality, one that has always surrounded us like the sea itself?